The morning light spilled across Evelyn Carter's modest kitchen, softening the edges of home that had weathered storms both literal and unseen. She stood at the counter, her hands kneading dough with the kind of measured patience that had once steadied her late husband through war and herself through grief. The smell of cinnamon and rising yeast mingled in the air. Across the table, her daughter Amara, 16, laughed at something on her phone, her braids swinging as she leaned forward. The laughter was a sound Evelyn lived for, gentle reminders that the world hadn't stolen everything from them. Their home bore the quiet strength of lives lived in defiance of erasure. Books lined every wall, volumes of history, poetry, and law collected over decades. Evelyn's husband had been a pilot, Air Force, then entrepreneur, and though his absence left an ache, his spirit lingered in the framed photographs, in the small garden outside that Evelyn tended like scripture. She was known in town as Professor Carter, the teacher who stayed after class, the woman who brought students food when they had none, the one who corrected with compassion and discipline alike. Yet in private, Evelyn carried layers most never saw. She woke in the night sometimes, startled by memories of being pulled over, questioned, belittled. She had lived long enough to know that brilliance did not insulate her from the ways the world measured her skin. On this morning, she dressed with quiet deliberation, navy blazer, crisp blouse, a thin gold necklace that had belonged to her mother. She was traveling to Atlanta for a conference on African American history, where she would deliver a keynote about the silences in America's storytelling. Amara helped zip her suitcase. "Mama," she said softly, "don't forget to smile at the cameras. You know they always catch you looking too serious." Evelyn laughed and brushed her cheek. Driving to the airport, she rolled the windows down, the late spring air rushing in. Her hands were steady on the wheel, the old gospel hymn humming low in her throat. She felt the weight of her husband's watch on her wrist, the one she had worn since his passing, as though his time might keep guiding hers. Inside the small regional airport, her presence drew glances, though she ignored them. She had grown used to being the only black woman in first-class boarding lanes. Still, she carried herself with quiet dignity, shoulders back, eyes forward. For Evelyn, every step into spaces where she was told she didn't belong was not an act of confrontation. It was an act of existence. She did not yet know that this flight would mark her life with fire and ash, that her name would echo across headlines and screens. All she knew, as she handed her ticket to the gate agent with a polite smile, was that she was tired of shrinking. She had lived too long in a country that measured her worth by the discomfort of others, and she was done folding herself small. When the wheels of the plane left the ground, Evelyn closed her eyes, breathed deep, and whispered beneath her breath, as she always did before a journey, "Lord, carry me." The plane cabin smelled faintly of recirculated air, leather seats, and the tang of stale coffee. Evelyn slipped into her assigned place in first class, second row by the window, sliding her carry-on neatly beneath the seat in front of her. She moved with Professor's poise, measured, deliberate, settling into the stillness of her corner. She had brought along Baldwin's of Fire Next Time, its pages worn soft with use, though she hadn't decided if she'd read or simply watched the clouds. Passengers filed in, dragging wheel bags and folded newspapers, a low murmur of greetings and sighs filling the narrow aisle. A businessman in an expensive suit, his tie loosened as though he'd been inconvenienced by the mere act of travel, approached. He paused when his eyes landed on Evelyn. His jaw stiffened. He glanced at the seat number on his boarding pass, then back at her as though the numbers themselves had betrayed him. It was subtle at first, the way he shifted his weight, cleared his throat, and looked toward the flight attendant with a hint of impatience. But Evelyn felt the ripple immediately, the same ripple she had felt in faculty lounges, in department stores, on sidewalks at dusk. The air between them was too thin, too charged. The flight attendant, a young blonde woman with a fixed smile, approached. "Sir, can I help you find your seat?" The man, Richard Halpern, did not lower his voice. "It appears to be this one," he said, gesturing stiffly to the empty seat beside Evelyn. "But there's been a mistake." Evelyn kept her gaze on her book. She had learned the art of silence, the power in refusing to dignify every insult with acknowledgement. "There's no mistake," the attendant assured. 2B is right here." Richard's voice sharpened. "I'm not sitting here. You'll need to move me or her." His eyes cut toward Evelyn like she was clutter, an obstacle left in his path. Passengers slowed in the aisle. Some pretended not to notice. Others glanced quickly and then away, their silence heavy with complicity. Evelyn felt the weight of 100 unspoken rules pressing against her. Don't make a scene. Don't raise your voice. Don't be the stereotype they're waiting for. She turned a page in her book. Her fingers steadied though her chest was tight. Her mother's voice echoed in memory. Baby, never let them decide who you are. They'll try, but they can't unless you hand it over. Richard leaned closer to the attendant. Those words carried. I paid for comfort. I expect comfort. I will not sit next to. He stopped short of finishing, but the venom lingered in the pause. The attendant's polite smile faltered. She shifted, uncomfortable. Sir, first class is full. There aren't any other seats available. Then put her in coach, Richard snapped. His voice was louder now, drawing more attention. That's where she belongs. The words landed heavy, not just for Evelyn, but for every ear within range. A man 2 rows back muttered something under his breath. A woman across the aisle raised her phone, the faint glow recording catching the corner of Evelyn's eye. Evelyn closed her book and placed it neatly in her lap. Her heart beat steady, though she could feel the blood rising warm against her skin. She lifted her chin and, in a voice calm and clear, said, I will not move. The attendant's smile collapsed entirely. Ma'am, perhaps it would be easier if... No, Evelyn said softly, with the kind of finality that left no room for negotiation. I paid for this seat, and I intend to remain in it. The cabin seemed to hold its breath. Richard's face reddened. He looked around, expecting allies, but found only shifting eyes and lowered gazes. His indignation swelled, louder, uglier, feeding on the silence around him. This is outrageous, he barked. Do you know who I am? Evelyn's gaze never wavered. Do you? She asked, voice low, almost a whisper, but sharp enough to cut through the noise. The flight attendant stiffened, flustered, reaching for the intercom to call ground security. Passengers began murmuring, some sympathetic, others nervous, all trapped in the tense theater of the moment. Evelyn sat unmoving, hands folded neatly over her book, her very stillness a form of resistance. Somewhere deep inside, she felt the old ache of every seat denied her ancestors, the buses, the counters, the classrooms. But this time, she thought, she would not rise to leave. She would not give them the comfort of her absence. The wheels of injustice had begun to turn, quietly at first, but fast enough that Evelyn could already hear their grinding in the distance. Perfect. Let's move into the escalation and injustice section. This is where the conflict reaches its breaking point, and Evelyn's quiet dignity collides with the full force of systemic bias. The hum of the engines deepened as the cabin door sealed, trapping the tension inside, like a storm building beneath metal skin. The flight attendant's polished professionalism had begun to unravel. She whispered into the intercom, her voice clipped and urgent. Evelyn caught fragments. Passenger refusing, disruptive, need ground assistance. Richard leaned back in his seat, smug, convinced victory was near. He pulled out his phone, tapped quickly, and muttered, My attorney will have a field day with the circus. His words weren't meant for Evelyn, but loud enough for her to hear, a performance of dominance. Around them, the other passengers shifted, uneasy. A woman in a floral dress leaned to her husband, whispering, This is making me nervous. The husband hushed her, eyes darting toward Evelyn like she was a cause of the disruption, not the man who refused to sit. A younger passenger, college-aged, hoodie pulled tight around his face, angled his phone toward the scene, capturing every detail. The faint red light of recording glowed like a witness in the shadows. Within minutes, 2 airport security officers boarded, their uniforms dark against the sterile brightness of the cabin. The lead officer, broad-shouldered with a clipped mustache, scanned the rows. His eyes landed not on Richard, but on Evelyn. Ma'am, he said, his tone already rehearsed, I'm going to need you to come with us. A ripple of disbelief broke across the cabin. Evelyn lifted her gaze to meet his. Her voice was steady, almost gentle. Why me? Sir here says you're being uncooperative. The officer gestured vaguely toward Richard, who smirked and leaned back, arms crossed like a king watching peasants quarrel. I am sitting in the seat I paid for, Evelyn replied. She kept her voice low, measured, but the words carried. I have broken no rules, disturbed no peace. Yet you come for me. The officer's jaw tightened. Ma'am, don't make this harder than it has to be. Evelyn folded her hands neatly in her lap. She felt the eyes of the cabin on her. Some sympathetic, some hostile, most complicit in their silence. Inside her chest, her heart pounded, not with fear but with a weary recognition. She had been here before, in classrooms where her expertise was doubted, in stores where clerks shadowed her, in hospital waiting rooms where her pain was dismissed. Always the same theater, always the same script. She inhaled, steadying herself. Her mother's voice returned, firm and unyielding. Hold your ground, child. They cannot move what refuses to bend. I am not moving. The officer's hand hovered near his belt, not quite reaching for the cuffs, but close enough to cast a shadow over the row. The cabin air thickened. Somewhere, a passenger gasped. Richard chuckled low, savoring the spectacle. And then, like lightning cracking through silence, the young passenger with the hoodie spoke. His voice trembled, but it carried. Why are you removing her? He's the one causing the scene. Heads turned. A murmur swelled. Someone else whispered, Yeah, I've been filming since he started yelling. Phones tilted higher, the faint clicks of digital eyes recording everything. Evelyn did not move. She felt a surge of something larger than herself, a tide rising quietly in her favor. Still, she kept her composure. She looked directly at the officer, her eyes unwavering. You can drag me off this plane if you must, but the world will see exactly what you chose. For a suspended moment, no one breathed. Then, with a sharp intake of frustration, the officer stepped back. He muttered into his radio, his voice clipped and irritable. Richard sputtered, This is ridiculous. This is my town. You'll regret this. But the cabin had shifted. Power had cracked. The plane did not move, not yet. But Evelyn had planted herself like stone. The injustice had tried to uproot her, and failed, at least for now. The cabin was still charged with unease, but the tide had shifted just enough that Richard's voice now sounded shrill rather than commanding. He jabbed a finger toward Evelyn, his words sharp, spit flecking at the corners of his mouth. You think you can just sit there and defy me? People like you don't belong here. Not in this seat. Not in this class. Not in this world. The words landed like poison, their ugliness so naked that even those who had tried to remain neutral stirred uncomfortably. A mother in the back row covered her daughter's ears. The young man with the hoodie muttered, unbelievable, under his breath, though his phone never wavered. Evelyn did not flinch. She sat perfectly still, her posture regal against the cheap leather seat. Years of classrooms had taught her restraint. Years of grief had carved patience into her bones. But beneath it all, a fire kindled, quiet, contained, but fierce. The flight attendant, caught between duty and discomfort, leaned toward Evelyn once more, her voice trembling. Ma'am, please. I think it would just be easier if you let us move you. For everyone's sake. Evelyn turned her gaze on her, eyes calm but unyielding. She spoke softly, but her voice carried a low resonance that made even the engine seem to quiet. For whose sake? His? Yours? Or the sake of a world that expects me to shrink every time it is offended by my presence? The attendant's cheeks flushed. She stepped back, chastened but still uncertain. Evelyn's hand moved to her bag, sliding out a leather folio worn from years of use. She placed it carefully on her lap, unfastened the clasp, and withdrew a set of neatly folded documents. Her fingers smoothed the edges with ritual precision. When she looked up, her eyes found Richard's, steady as stone. You want to know who I am? She said, her voice steady. The air seemed to still. I am Dr. Evelyn Carter, professor of American history, keynote speaker at the National Educators Conference. She let the words hang, then unfolded the paper with deliberate slowness. And since you seem to care so deeply about who sits beside you, perhaps you'll be relieved to know this. I am also the majority shareholder of this airline, which means she paused, her gaze sweeping the stunned faces around her. This seat and every seat on this plane belongs to me. Gasps rippled through the cabin. The words hit like a thunderclap, reverberating against every surface. Richard's smirk faltered, his face blanching before flushing crimson. His mouth opened, then closed, as though the very language he wielded as a weapon had been stripped from him. The flight attendant's eyes widened, her composure unraveling. You own? Yes, Evelyn said simply, folding the papers back into her folio. This airline was built by my late husband, a pilot who believed in creating opportunity where there was none. He left it to me when he passed. And though I prefer to quiet my classroom, I carry his work forward. So let me be clear, I will not move. The silence that followed was electric. The balance of power had shifted in an instant. The invisible hierarchy flipped on its head. Passengers leaned forward, phones lifted higher, recording not just an act of defiance but a revelation. Richard stammered, This is a setup. She's bluffing. Evelyn leaned forward just slightly, her voice dropping low, sharp as glass. You wanted to know who I was. Now you do. The officer, who had been hovering uncertainly, glanced between Evelyn and the documents in her lap. His posture shifted, no longer the looming threat, but a man calculating his retreat. The flight attendant swallowed hard, her tone suddenly deferential. Of course, Dr. Carter. Please remain comfortable. For the first time, Evelyn allowed herself the smallest of smiles, not triumphant, not gloating, but the smile of a woman who had refused to be erased. She turned back to her book, opening it calmly, as if the storm around her had never existed. Perfect. Let's carry the story into community and media reaction. This is where Evelyn's private act of resistance becomes a public flashpoint, and she must face both the light of support and the shadow of backlash. By the time Evelyn stepped off the plane in Atlanta, her face was already circling the internet. The video, 2 shaky minutes filmed from the row behind, had been uploaded before the wheels left the tarmac. It showed Richard's outburst in full color. His reddened face, his fingers stabbing the air, his voice dripping contempt as he demanded Evelyn be removed. And then, Evelyn's calm revelation, her voice low, steady, dignified, cutting to the noise. This seat and every seat on this plane belongs to me. The clip exploded across social media within hours. Hashtags carried her name alongside words like queen, hero, owner. To some, she became a symbol of quiet resistance, proof that composure could topple arrogance. But in the shadows of praise came venom. Comment threads filled with slurs, accusations, conspiracy theories. When she checked into her Atlanta hotel, the concierge gave her a strange, lingering look before offering a hesitant smile. Dr. Carter, welcome. We've been expecting you. She didn't know what he meant until she turned on the television in her room. Her own face stared back at her from the screen, a frozen still from the plane. Headline scrolled beneath. Passenger owns airline after racist confrontation. Community college professor shocks businessman mid-flight. Evelyn sat heavily on the edge of the bed, the weight of it pressed on her chest. She had not asked for this stage. Yet here she was, thrust into it with no script but her own integrity. Back in her hometown, the reaction splintered along familiar fault lines. In the black neighborhoods, her name rang like gospel. At the corner barbershop, men replayed the clip on loop, their laughter erupting when Richard's face collapsed into disbelief. In kitchens, mothers showed their children. See? Stand tall. Don't let them shrink you. At church that Sunday, the pastor worked her name into his sermon, voice booming. The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. But in the polished offices downtown, the mood was sour. Richard had friends, powerful ones. His development company had long bankroll campaigns, grease palms, whispered into the ears of mayors and judges. At the Rotary Club luncheon, men in suits shook their heads over roast beef. She embarrassed him, one muttered, and if she embarrassed him, she embarrassed us all. The local paper, controlled by Richard's allies, ran an editorial within 48 hours. Its headline dripped with disdain, professor or provocateur. Small-town teacher sparks national drama. They painted her as an opportunist, accused her of weaponizing race for attention. Anonymous callers began leaving messages on her office voicemail. Go back to teaching your little classes. Don't think you're untouchable. At the college, her colleagues avoided her eyes in the hallway. A few offered timid words of support, but most stayed silent, fearful of aligning themselves with her. It was her students who carried her forward. They packed her classroom, phones buzzing with updates, notebooks open not just for history lessons, but for guidance on how to survive a world watching you too closely. One evening, Amara sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through her phone, her face pale with worry. "Mama," she whispered, "they're saying you're a fraud, that you don't really own it. They're digging through everything." Her hands trembled slightly as she held the screen out. Evelyn took it gently, closed it, and pressed her daughter's fingers still. "They will say many things," Evelyn said, her voice low, her eyes tired but burning. "But the truth has a way of surviving the fire." By the week's end, national news anchors requested interviews. Civil rights organizations reached out with statements of solidarity. A well-known attorney left a message on her office line. "Dr. Carter, if you ever need counsel, call me." The storm was no longer contained in that cabin. It had spilled into the town, into the country, into the bloodstream of a nation forever hungry for symbols. Evelyn had not sought this. But now that it had found her, she would not turn away. She stood at her window that night, the garden dark beneath the stars, and whispered to her husband as though he were beside her still. "They tried to take my seat," she said softly, "but they've given me a stage instead." "Excellent. Now we'll move into legal or tactical counterattack, where Evelyn channels a storm of attention into a deliberate, strategic strike. This is where the story's intelligence, restraint, and quiet power sharpen into action. The phone calls piled up faster than Evelyn could answer them. Journalists wanted sound bites, activists wanted appearances, lawyers wanted signatures. Each voice pulled at her, tried to shape her into a banner for their cause. But Evelyn had never been anyone's banner. She was a teacher, a mother, a woman who had learned that dignity was her truest weapon. She didn't move in haste. She moved in silence, in patience, in calculation. Late one evening, after Amara had gone to bed, Evelyn spread her late husband's files across the dining room table. He had been meticulous with paperwork. Insurance policies neatly labeled, trust documents stacked in manila folders. And there, beneath a blue binder marked investments, she found a paper trail. Board minutes, stock purchase agreements, letters of transfer. Every one of them bore his careful signature, every one of them linking back to her. Proof undeniable. Proof Richard and his circle had not anticipated would surface. She felt her chest rise with something like grief and gratitude as she ran her fingers across the pages. He had known, on some level, he had known this day would come, that she would need more than love to survive in a world like this. He had left her not just assets, but armor. The next morning, Evelyn dressed deliberately, not for spectacle, but for command. A charcoal gray suit, pearl earrings, hair pulled into a bun that revealed the quiet authority in her posture. She walked into the offices of Jacob Rosen, the attorney who had left his message. His firm was small but relentless, known for civil rights cases that rattled city halls and corporate boardrooms alike. Rosen greeted her with a respectful nod. "Dr. Carter," he said, motioning her to sit. "You don't know me, but I've been following your story closely. Richard," he paused, as if selecting the right word. "Richard is a man used to throwing his weight around. But I believe you have more leverage than he realizes." Evelyn slid the binder across the desk. "He believes this is a story of humiliation. What it really is," she said calmly, "is a story of ownership." Rosen flipped through the documents, his expression shifting from interest to astonishment. "This is airtight," he murmured. "Every filing, every share, it's all here. Dr. Carter, you don't just own the airline. You own a piece of Richard's silence, and maybe his undoing." By the week's end, Rosen filed a civil suit, not for damages alone, but for defamation and racial discrimination, naming Richard personally and his development company by extension. The suit landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples across the town. The very men who had smirked over their luncheon now read the legal brief with clenched jaws. For the first time, Richard wasn't simply embarrassed. He was endangered. Evelyn refused television interviews but released a single written statement through her attorney. It was brief, measured, and devastating in its restraint. "I did not ask to be the center of the story, but since I have been placed here, I will not shrink from it. Racism thrives in silence. I intend to meet it in the open, with truth and law as my witnesses." The words traveled faster than any viral clip. In churches, they were recited like scripture. In classrooms, they were pinned to bulletin boards. On talk shows, pundits dissected each line. Evelyn had spoken not as a victim, not as a celebrity, but as a citizen refusing to bow. Richard, on the other hand, lashed out. He filed countersuits, called her fraud on live television, and stormed into board meetings with a fury that rattled even his oldest allies. But every time he raised his voice, Evelyn's silence rang louder. Every time he tried to smear her, the documents in Rosen's binder reminded the world where the truth lived. At home, Amara watched her mother with new eyes. There was fear, yes, fear of retaliation, of whispers in parking lots, of shadow cars driving slowly past their house. But there was also awe. "You don't even have to shout, Mama," she said one evening, voice soft. "You just stand, and it's enough." Evelyn looked at her daughter, at the future she was quietly trying to carve through fire and smoke, and allowed herself the faintest smile. "Standing," she said, "is the hardest thing, but it's the only way we move forward." And so the battle shifted. No longer just a story told in airports and comment threads. It was now written in court filings, in televised hearings, in the sudden tremor of men unaccustomed to being challenged. Evelyn had turned the seat Richard tried to deny her into a platform he could no longer escape. The war was no longer about humiliation. It was about truth, and whose voice would carry it furthest. The courthouse steps were crowded before the sun had even burned the mist off the river. Reporters leaned over barricades with cameras poised like rifles. Protesters held cardboard signs daubed with words that shook in the morning breeze. "Justice is seated here. Dignity is not for sale." Across the street, men in tailored suits stood in a tight circle, speaking low, eyes sharp. Richard was among them, jaw set, hair slicked to perfection. He looked less like a businessman and more like a cornered animal. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with heat. Wooden pews overflowed with townspeople, journalists, and church mothers who come in Sunday hats, fanning themselves with folded programs. The room carried a tension that made every cough and shuffle echo like a warning. Evelyn sat at the front, back straight, hands folded neatly in her lap. She wore no jewelry beyond her wedding band, no colors beyond the navy of her suit. If Richard came armored in money and lawyers, she came armored in presence. The judge entered, robe swaying and the air stilled. What followed was less trial than theater, but theater with consequences. Richard's attorneys opened with venom. They painted Evelyn as opportunistic, a widow clinging to paperwork she did not understand, a woman who had mistaken grief for entitlement. Their words dripped with condescension, each syllable calibrated to reduce her to just another angry black woman who had stumbled into power she did not deserve. But Rosen rose with quiet force, the kind that doesn't need to pound the table. He didn't posture, didn't thunder. He simply began to lay the documents out, one by one, sliding them across the polished oak like cards in a game Richard had already lost. Share transfers, stock certificates, handwritten notes in her late husband's script. The silence in the room deepened with each page, as if the very walls leaned in to listen. At one point, Richard exploded. He shot to his feet, face flushed, voice shaking with rage. "This is a fraud." He barked, pointing at Evelyn as if she were a trespasser in his world. "She doesn't belong here. She never belonged here." The judge's gavel cracked, demanding order. But it was Evelyn who truly silenced the room. She didn't stand. She didn't raise her voice. She simply turned her head and looked at Richard, not with anger, but with something far more dangerous. Pity. When she finally did speak, her voice was soft enough to make everyone lean forward. "I belonged the moment I walked onto that plane," she said. "I belonged the moment my husband signed these papers. And I belong now, whether you choose to see it or not." Gasps rippled through the pews. Cameras clicked like applause. For a moment, Richard seemed to shrink, his outrage collapsing into something smaller, weaker. By the afternoon, testimony had ended. The judge, citing the irrefutable evidence and the malicious public humiliation Evelyn had endured, ruled decisively in her favor. Richard's countersuit was dismissed outright. Her ownership, long buried in legal shadows, was not just affirmed. It was spotlighted. The airline, the company, the dignity he tried to strip from her were all restored with the authority of the court. When Evelyn rose to leave, the crowd stood with her. Not in a cheer, not in chaos, but in reverent silence, a collective acknowledgement that history had tilted, if only by a degree, because one woman refused to bend. She stepped into the daylight, cameras flashing, chants beginning to swell. For a moment she closed her eyes and let the sun warm her face. The same sun that had fallen on her trembling hands in her kitchen weeks ago now seemed to bless her victory. Richard, meanwhile, slipped out a side door, shadowed by lawyers who spoke into their phones with clipped urgency. His empire had not fallen, but it had cracked. And the crack had a name, Evelyn Carter. The showdown had not been about money or shares, not really. It had been about recognition, about who is seen, who is silenced, and who chooses to stand even when silence might feel safer. Perfect. This final movement will quiet the storm, not with passivity, but with the gravity of healing, legacy, and transformation. Here's the resolution and transformation in the cinematic style you asked for. The weeks after the verdict carried a strange stillness, as though the town itself was catching its breath. The courthouse crowd had dispersed. The protest signs folded into closets, but the memory of what had unfolded lingered in shop windows, in whispered conversations at church, in the glances strangers gave Evelyn at the grocery store. Where once she had felt eyes on her, as if she were intruding, now the looks carried something different. Not pity, not suspicion, recognition. She moved through her days with the same rhythm as before. The kettle steaming on the stove in the mornings, the garden tended with careful hands, the framed photograph of her husband cleaned of dust each Sunday. But beneath that quiet routine was a current of something new, a dignity no longer forced into silence. The airline, her airline, announced changes in hush press conferences, board reshuffles, policy reforms, promises of diversity that sounded rehearsed but, for once, felt necessary. She didn't care for the optics. She cared for the fact that her signature now carried the weight of authority. For years she had been overlooked, dismissed as a widow clinging to memory. Now, entire rooms waited for her voice before decisions were made. But the true victory was not in corporate papers or stock dividends. It was in the children. On Saturdays, she began holding gatherings at the old community center, reading sessions, mentoring talks, spaces where young black boys and girls could sit at long folding tables and hear her tell the story, not as gossip or spectacle, but as truth. She told them about the day she was asked to move from her rightful seat and how she chose stillness over rage. About the courtroom, where silence and evidence spoke louder than shouting. About her husband's legacy, and the quiet strength it had taken to honor it. Their eyes stayed wide, their pencils still in their notebooks, as if imprinting the lesson into their bones. That dignity is not weakness, and truth is not fragile. In the town itself, something subtle shifted. The diner on Main Street that once catered only to the regulars saw new faces at its counters. The church whose pastor had kept silent during the conflict opened its doors for a unity service, hymns rising from throats that had long sung in separate choirs. Even Richard's allies, stripped of his shadow, began to distance themselves, their handshakes less confident, their influence thinner. One evening, Evelyn returned to the courthouse alone. The steps were empty, the marble cool beneath her hand as she traced the railing. She stood for a long time in the square where her name had first been spoken like a challenge, then like a victory. The sun dipped low, painting the windows gold. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to cry, not from sorrow, but from release. The fight had taken pieces of her, but it had also returned something she had nearly forgotten, herself. When she finally turned to go, she walked not as a widow burdened by her husband's legacy, but as a woman carrying her own. The night gathered around her like a cloak, but the lamplight followed her steps, steady and unwavering. The town would remember the trial. The papers would archive her name. The children would tell the story again and again. And Evelyn Carter, once told to move, to disappear, to know her place, had written her own ending. It was not a victory born of spectacle or rage. It was a victory born of patience, strategy, and the quiet conviction that dignity, once claimed, can never be taken away. Got it. Here's the YouTube thumbnail prompt for this story, written in the exact reusable format you asked for. Rich passenger refuses to sit next to Latina woman. Then flight attendant discovers she owns the airline.